He was both a humanitarian and a warrior.
He was kind of like MacArthur, General MacArthur. People loved him or they hated him.
He had the vision to see a great future for the Navy.
He gave dignity to the enlisted ranks.
The overwhelming factor shaping Zumwalt's character was his relationship with his dad. He really admired him. He was a role model, a real leader, very much looked up to in the community of Tulare, California.
After leaving California, Bud Zumwalt attended the United States Naval Academy, graduating early in 1942 because of World War II. He began service aboard USS Phelps, serving in the Solomon Islands. His next ship was USS Robinson, DD 562, where he earned a Bronze Star for valor.
He had a bold, hard-charging character and sense of adventure.
At the end of World War II, when his ship had captured a Japanese gunboat, and my father and 10 sailors were put as prize crew on this ship with about 200 Japanese prisoners. My father ended up commanding the first ship to come into Shanghai, flying the American flag at the end of World War II.
Part of Zumwalt's mission was to meet and coordinate with Admiral Milton Mary Miles, who had run the Navy guerrilla war in China.
After a couple of weeks, 3 of his Annapolis classmates came up to him and said that they had been invited to a dinner at a Russian home, and they understood there were going to be 4 single Russian girls there, and they needed a 4th. He described the first one as a statuesque blonde. He said, "I saw the second one and my heart stopped. I never saw the other 2. And the second one was obviously my mother."
Married on October 22, 1945, Musa Kutle de Rocher was the love of his life.
During the Korean War, he was navigator of the USS Wisconsin and very heavily depended upon by his skipper, Captain Bruton, who was a submariner, and so Zumwalt's surface ship experience was very helpful doing the shore bombardment in Korea and what have you.
After service aboard Battleship Wisconsin during the Korean conflict, Bud Zumwalt had a variety of commands. In 1959, he became the first commanding officer of USS Dewey, the first ship designed from the keel up as a guided missile destroyer.
He particularly was interested in anti-submarine warfare against the Soviets. This is still part of the Cold War, and this means dealing with the Soviet submarine threat, which was quite numerous.
In 1962, he published a prescient article in Proceedings that foreshadowed his strategic vision. Not following the advice of fellow officers, Bud took a position with Paul Nitze, Under Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs.
Paul Nitze was Zumwalt's mentor, and what he taught Zumwalt to do involved a breadth of understanding and an analysis and bringing a political acumen to situations that he didn't have before he started working with Nitze.
Captain Zumwalt was Nitze's naval aide, both when he was in Secretary of Defense and later when he was Secretary of the Navy. Obviously gave him a broad perspective on views throughout the Navy.
Promoted to Vice Admiral, Zumwalt moved on to command Naval Forces Vietnam.
It's very easy for leaders to stifle dissent or to stifle people from speaking out once a consensus is built. But Admiral Zumwalt was one of these rare people who encouraged that in a number of environments, and so he told his staff, don't be afraid to ever bring me an idea, no matter how absurd it may seem, and we're going to call them the Zumwalt Wild Ideas. In Vietnam, in particular ZWIs, if Zumwalt had never become CNO, we would be talking about how we changed the strategic environment in Vietnam.
The Navy had been in Vietnam in the brown water arena for quite some time, but things had kind of stagnated by the time he got there. When we first got there, we cleared the rivers of the Viet Cong and took back the paths to get the rice to the market and that sort of thing. But at that point, things kind of stagnated because they had given us the rivers, but they had gone up into the delta and were using the smaller waterways to come in to infiltrate South Vietnam through the Mekong Delta. What he did was he consolidated the various forces into a new thing called Task Force 194, which was the Operation Sea Lords. What that did was, by consolidating these things, he was then able to go deep into the delta, establish a barrier, which was, of course, a front line One of the ironies of all this is that, that casualties went up among the American forces, but so did morale, because for the first time they felt like, first time in a long time, they felt like they were really accomplishing something.
To protect the riverine forces from being fired on from ashore, Admiral Zumwalt ordered the use of a defoliant called Agent Orange that wiped out the trees and so forth along the banks and made it much harder for the enemy to have places of concealment.
This effective tactical decision came at a price to be paid later for the Admiral.
Admiral Zumwalt got the attention of Richard Nixon, among others, through his efforts in Vietnam, and ultimately wound up being jumped over, I think, 33 admirals to become the Chief of Naval Operations, the youngest one ever at that point. So,
Project 60 was an idea that Zumwalt had, and with some of those closest to him, to essentially hit the ground running when he became CNO in the summer of 1970.
The 60 came in, he said, within 60 days I'll have a piece of paper on your desk, or a stack of papers on your desk, to the Secretary of the Navy and Secretary of Defense. And it took in the naval strategy and so forth, and the construction, what kind of ships we would need. He practically unloaded all his thoughts in that Project 60.
Out of Project 60 emerged the concept of the high-low mix, and a plan to quickly eliminate obsolete ships to counter the modernizing Soviet fleet.
I remember being on a Naval Reserve cruise in 1970 on board a destroyer, and the skipper showed me some messages called Z-grams, and these were the policy initiatives.
through his Z-grams, Admiral Zumwalt revolutionized the Navy.
The stereotype of the enlisted force was not a particularly upstanding one. Stereotypical in the enlisted force, I think people expected less of an enlisted person. They weren't expected to be educated, and by and large they weren't.
Bear in mind that at that time, in the minority community, we had the lowest number of minority officers, and we had a tradition of segregation, that the remnants that were still there all the way around. How could we quickly change it?
Here comes Admiral Zumwalt, and all of a sudden he's putting out these Z-grams that says you can do this, you can do that, and I'm going to expect you to conduct yourself such a way.
They covered a vast array of topics: increased opportunities for women in the Navy, increased opportunities for minorities, African Americans. He had things about making life better for sailors so that they would have more morale.
We were not trying to create a Navy in which any group, any segment, was anything other than an integral part.
My father did so much for all the minorities, Filipino, African Americans. He saw those barriers were there, and he wanted to bring them down.
The changes had to be made, and we now have not only African American at all ranks, but we also have Filipinos at all ranks. And in the enlisted categories, the restriction of those ethnic groups to just the housekeeping rates was eliminated, and they now are doing wonderfully in all the ratings.
He was trying to get across a message that regardless as to how good our hardware and our systems are, we need people.
The last act of office for my father was to get rid of the 121 Z-grams because he felt that that course change had been made significantly enough that the ship wouldn't go back to its old ways. The use of Agent Orange saved literally thousands and thousands and thousands of lives. In wartime, a commander makes the least worst decision he can make, and clearly based on what he was told by the chemical companies, that was the right decision.
The first 2 or 3 months, our casualties were running at the rate of 6% a month, which meant that the average young man had about a 70% probability of being killed or wounded in his year's tour. We used Agent Orange to defoliate the banks and drive the enemy back from the boats as they ambushed them, and the casualties promptly dropped to less than 1% a month.
The downside was we didn't learn until well after the war was over that the chemical companies had lied, And unfortunately, the bitter irony for our family is that one of those who fell victim to that was my brother.
His son, Elmo, was commanding officer of a swift boat, got into the water that was infested with the Agent Orange, and later came down with a couple of forms of cancer and eventually died as a result.
I have known of no father-son relationship that I think has the incredible bond that has been honed by the searing events that we've shared. And it's a relationship that is incredibly lasting.
As he has said, even knowing today what the consequences were, the immediate impact was so great that he would have done it again.
Instead of 1 out of every 10,000 coming down with cancer in a normal population, in the Vietnam population, probably 15 or 20 of that 10,000 will come down with cancer. But in that same Vietnam population, 10,000 would have been killed or wounded, had we not used it.
The tragedy of Agent Orange led Bud Zumwalt to work tirelessly to get veterans benefits and compensation for those ill from its use in Vietnam. He also became a founder of the National Bone Marrow Directory. For this work, Elmo Zumwalt was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom by Bill Clinton in 1998.
Yes, he is a former sailor. He is also one of the greatest models of integrity and leadership and genuine humanity our nation has ever produced.
Elmo Bud Zumwalt passed away on January 2nd, 2000.
His legacy is alive and well, and this ship obviously gives it a big boost, but it's my belief that historians for many years to come will recognize what my father did in the short 4 years in office that he had to do it.
This ship, the steel, it didn't bend itself. That men and women of conviction and intellect have used their brains and bodies to bend the steel. And Admiral Zumwalt was the guy who bent the institution of the Navy toward a more just institution.
I think it's a great ship. It has a great future. And I think just like Admiral Zumwalt when he was CNO, it will make a huge difference in the United States Navy for the 21st century.
I think it's going to be a transitional vessel. I think it's going to sort of be the vessel that takes us from the kind of ships that we build today into ships of the future that are going to be a lot different. They're going to look a lot different, and they're going to carry weapons that are a lot different. They're going to be propelled differently, and they're going to be operated differently than the way we do things today. And what better legacy could you have than having a ship named after someone like Admiral Zumwalt that brings that all home, because he changed everything.
When our historians look back on the century we have just left, they may well record that Arleigh Burke was the spirit of the United States Navy. They will certainly recall that Bud Zumwalt was its conscience.